I'm Liz Clayman.
I'm Chris Wallace.
I'm Maria Bartiromo, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, September 17th, 2021. I'm Eben Brown. Americans and Afghans continue to leave Afghanistan, if they're lucky, on Qatari airlifts as life in the country changes and is more scary than it has been in decades.
Those who aren't able to make it out of the country, they have to adjust their entire mindset simply to stay alive, because you can be killed in many places for breaking the rules, for disobeying the law.
This is the Fox News Rundown Evening Edition. We keep hearing about the situation in Afghanistan. The nation of Qatar has been arranging transport for Americans and Afghan nationals looking to leave, and they're emerging as a diplomatic force, gaining trust of the Taliban and seeing American interests be addressed.
The past 24 hours have had some positive developments.
Fox's Trey Yingst is back once again in Kabul, the Afghan capital. He reports that some are getting out, many can't. Those who are left behind are enduring perhaps the world's most restrictive government again.
There were a group of 170 people able to get on a Qatari charter flight today and fly out of Afghanistan. This was mostly foreign nationals who held dual citizenship, but it was a promising sign because it means there is ongoing coordination with the Taliban, the State Department, and the Qataris, the biggest players in getting specifically Americans out, but anyone who wants to leave Afghanistan out of the country. So that was something I would consider promising, but it does come amid a very tense time in Afghanistan. The Taliban still controls the country, and they will for the foreseeable future. They are not facing really any opposition right now. People are very afraid to stand up to the group, and they are cracking down on basic ways of life for the Afghan people. They've banned music. They are no longer allowing men and women to work together, and a woman who goes out in public now has to cover her hair, if not wear a full burqa. So it's a very different lifestyle for the Afghan people, especially in the capital of Kabul, because they were used to a more Western lifestyle. They have things like shopping malls and bowling alleys. And while those things still exist, the way they can engage with their life and their society is very different.
You mentioned a Qatari jetliner taking people who wish to leave the country out of the country. Qatar has really stepped up in this role, it seems, over the past couple of weeks, providing this transportation and I guess performing the very complicated or delicate task of communicating with all parties, including the Taliban, which I think, in the most lenient of terms, you know, that they're very fickle with who they are going to talk with and who they're going to engage with and who and when they'll allow people to leave. So has Qatar really assumed a sort of a leadership role here? Does Qatar view this as a crisis? What does Qatar think what does Qatar as a nation expect to accomplish by taking on this role?
Well, the Qataris play a unique role in all of this. They're able to act as a bridge between the Taliban and the Americans and other Western players who wouldn't normally speak directly with the Taliban. They're able really to change their position in the international community. We can look back at recent history, and they were criticized for a lot of decisions they made in the Gulf and had some disagreements with other countries, including the Saudis. But now they're sort of emerging as this new global player in diplomacy. And they're a very small country in the Gulf, but have played a very big role in these evacuations. We were actually on a Qatari evacuation flight towards the end of August, and the way they conducted the operation was very organized, it was very formal, and they've continued that throughout the process following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Even today, and I'll tell you about the scene at the hotel we're staying at earlier today. A Qatari convoy basically came to pick up foreigners. It became a checkpoint for people who had the permission to leave the country, and Qatar basically made a pathway between this hotel and the airport to ensure that the Taliban knew it was happening and that they would have reinforcements to avoid getting stuck or stopped by other groups or people in Kabul. So they basically want to be seen as a country that is not only using diplomacy, but also security to get people to safety and then find a way to engage with the Taliban and the international community, because I think that's really the big question we have moving forward. What role will Qatar play in normalizing the Taliban's relations with the world? Because there is a firm understanding, I think, in this region that you can't simply isolate the Taliban because they are now in control of Afghanistan. And despite a dark past and present for this group, they now control the country. And millions of innocent civilians, Afghans who live under their rule, will be affected by the decisions made by the international community. So you almost have to engage with the Taliban at some level when it comes to humanitarian aid and other programs, and Qatar will play some role in mediation in all of that.
Is Qatar doing this on behalf of, I would say, Western interests, but I mean in code the United States? Or are they doing this despite the United States? Not to spite, but despite the United States, because the United States has seemed to have taken this abandonment approach to this scenario. Are they filling a void here, or are they doing this as an agent, if you will, or on at the behest of the United States?
I would definitely be at the behest of the United States because they do have that unique leverage in the region. The U.S. State Department is still playing a role in these evacuations, though they don't have a presence on the ground. They can't send in special forces or security teams to escort people to the airport like the Qataris are doing. They will not be permitted to land American aircraft at the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, now known as the Kabul International Airport. The name was changed by the Taliban. But Qatar is a real ally of the United States in the region, and both sides have made that very clear over the past month and a half. We were in Doha earlier this month, and there was a joint press conference with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and their counterparts in Qatar. And that was really the entire opening section of the press conference had to do with talking about the relationship between Doha and Washington. So both see mutual interest in having that alliance and that friendship as they described it. And I think this is really just a focal point of those conversations that happened behind the scenes before the international media was focused on Afghanistan, right? Because these issues were happening well beyond that August 15th takeover of Kabul and the Taliban declaring victory. There were conversations ongoing for over a year because while the United States didn't think the Taliban would be able to move so quickly through Afghanistan, and there were clearly intelligence failures when it comes to the fall of Kabul, even just days before, American officials didn't think it would happen. Still, there was an understanding this is a security situation that's delicate, and it did require the role of the Qataris. And just one note, an important thing to remember, many Western political outfits, embassies that were based in Kabul have now moved to Doha, and they will remain there for the foreseeable future until there is a firm security situation and a decision is made by individual countries if they want to move their embassy personnel back to the Afghan capital.
You've been listening to Fox News correspondent Trey Yingst from Kabul, Afghanistan, on the Fox News Rundown Evening Edition. We'll be right back.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Download and listen to Everyone Talks to Liz. Fox Business's Liz Clayman talks with entrepreneurs and executives about inspiring and motivational stories. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
I want to go back to something you were talking about a few moments ago about life changing in Afghanistan, specifically in Kabul, and specifically for women. It's been a few weeks now. Life is dramatically different to what many of these women and young women have known, and some of them, I assume, have not known anything else. I mean, if a young woman is 18 or 17, she did not know the Taliban rule previously, and now she's being made to change her life dramatically and be subjected to some very strict social orders. What can you tell us about that? What more can you tell us? Because you mentioned that recreation is now different. We've heard that schooling is different. While women can be educated, they must attend separate classes from men, and they must still cover their bodies entirely. Tell us more about that.
I think back to an interview we did with a group of university women in Doha. They had just gotten on an evacuation flight out of Kabul in the very early days of those airlifts. And they were so frustrated about the Taliban takeover because they were studying in university. They were so focused on finishing their degrees and going on with their lives, having a social life, doing things that normal university students would do. And all of that was ripped away from them, this sense of normalcy. And for women living under Taliban rule, they are not first-class citizens. In many cases, they're barely second-class citizens. I mean, you can no longer work in the same places you worked before if you're a woman. You can no longer study in the same places that you studied before if you are a woman. And you can no longer be treated as an equal member of society if you are a woman. And that is a reality under the Taliban control of Afghanistan. We see it in the streets. You see very few women walking through the streets of Kabul, and those that you do are wearing a hijab or burqa. And as you note, there are plenty of adult women who never lived life under Taliban rule. And so those who aren't able to make it out of the country, they have to adjust their entire mindset simply to stay alive, because you can be killed in many places for breaking the rules, for disobeying the laws. And it's a scary reality for these women, but it's a reality that they must face if they are still in Afghanistan.
Have women been killed yet in these past few weeks for these, I say this with air quotes, infractions? There
are reports of many former Afghan troops being killed. There are a lot of broad reports from more rural parts of Afghanistan about extrajudicial killings. We have pretty much stayed away from those reports, other than citing that the reports do exist, because it's extremely hard to confirm. I spoke to one person in Kabul who described Kabul as this bubble from the rest of the country, and it really is true. There's very few international media still operating in Afghanistan as a country, and those who are, the majority of them are in the capital of Kabul. So you think about the rest of this country with millions of people and locations far from this hub that we're in right now, and it's difficult to know exactly what's happening in those areas, and that was what this person expressed to me, basically saying, if you think it's bad here and what you're seeing in the streets of Kabul, imagine what it's like in other parts of the country. And we talked about that when we were here in August, explaining basically that there is a lens into Afghanistan through Kabul, but we don't know how bad it is in the rest of Afghanistan.
What about life for men? What's different for them?
I'll take you to the streets earlier today. We walked in front of a mosque where Friday prayers were taking place, and ultimately went inside the mosque where there were hundreds of men preparing for prayers and then ultimately praying, going through traditional Friday prayers at mosque. And there is a message the Taliban wants to deliver to these civilians, especially men, who in this mosque there were only men. Basically that the Taliban is in control, and from their perspective, they want people to understand their message is they are bringing security. Now that security comes at an extremely high price, but if you're a man in Kabul or in Afghanistan as a whole, you risk your life if you question those in power. And that is a new reality for those men, because Kabul, as we've talked about, was not under Taliban control this summer, for example. And it was always thought of as the sort of last stand that wasn't going to fall as quickly as these other areas and provinces. But inside this mosque, you had all of these men lined up, some of them educated, some of them not. And there was an imam at the front, some Taliban commanders throughout, and gunmen at every pillar of the mosque on the backside, and a few spread throughout the middle to make sure the security inside was taken care of, we imagine. And basically they were delivering a message. Some of the message was quite direct, and they talked about the takeover of the country and the victory of the Taliban, because from their perspective, they drove out the enemy from Afghanistan. This was a victory for the Taliban, and they are making it very clear. We talked to Anas Haqqani over the past 48 hours, and he explained in a very jarring sentence. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase it here rather than directly quote it because I don't have it in front of me, but he said something to the effect of, the aim was always to get Americans out of Afghanistan. That's why Afghans put on suicide vests. And he said this as a matter of fact. Don't you understand? And then went to follow up when I asked him the question to say, you would do the same thing if there were foreign powers, again, paraphrasing here, in your land. So it just gives you a sense of those in control, because that man is part of the Haqqani network, part of the Taliban, and part of now the leadership of this country.
Fox News correspondent Trey Yingst in Kabul, Afghanistan, yet again. Thanks for being with us on the Fox News Rundown Evening Edition.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Listen to be part of the conversation with me, Brian Kilmeade. I'll talk about the biggest stories of the day and get your take along with some of the biggest newsmakers around. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the podcast at briankilmeadshow.com.